Professor Nam Yong Lee's commentary, long form. Where has my vote gone? Hello, this is Professor Nam Yong Lee on Lee Nam Yong Professor TV. Where has my vote gone? The black box between voting and counting. On election day, citizens carefully choose their preferred candidate, stand in line, and stamp their seal on the ballot paper with great sincerity. Yet, from that moment on, most people never actually see with their own eyes what happens next. How exactly the ballot box is sealed, where it is transported, who opens it and in what manner, through which systems the votes are aggregated, and how all of that is finally converted into the numbers we see as the official result. When asked about this, many citizens say, "I have heard explanations, but I have no clear memory of ever seeing it myself." That is the enormous black box that lies between voting and the counting of votes. From a relational perspective, a single ballot paper is an object, while the chain that connects the polling station, early voting stations, overseas polling places, counting centres, data centres, and finally the public release of the results is the relationship. The current debate on elections in Korea is trapped in an emotional fight over was there fraud or not. However, the more fundamental question is much simpler. Why am I, the voter, unable to trace how and where my own ballot is processed all the way to the end? The moment the state cannot provide a transparent answer to this question, the covenant of trust between the system and the citizenry begins to crack. There are more than 170 countries in the world that hold elections. Among them, most democratic states that conduct free and competitive elections do not merely say, "trust the result," they say, "watch the process." They build systems in which citizens and political parties jointly observe the sealing of ballot boxes, the routes of transport, the adding up of numbers at counting centres, the intermediate aggregation, and the final announcement. In our country, there is still a strong tendency to rely simply on confidence in the National Election Commission. They will take care of it. Trust is precious, but in a modern democracy, trust is completed and strengthened only when it is anchored in verification. The front line of the war over the system, a single ballot paper. The phrase "war over the system" does not refer to some grandiose ideological clash. It begins in a very concrete reality. That reality is the fact that a single ballot paper is the last shield protecting a democratic republic. At the moment a citizen goes to the polling booth and stamps a seal on the ballot, the social contract that the sovereign power in this nation still resides with the people is renewed. But once the whereabouts of that ballot become opaque, the fundamental trust between the people and the state begins to wobble. This is precisely the front line of the war over the system. International statistics show that voter turnout is steadily declining in many countries. In a large number of OECD member states, turnout in general elections hovers around 60%, and in some countries it falls below 50%. The reasons for declining turnout are complex, but at the core lie a sense of futility, my vote will not change anything, and a deepening distrust, I do not want to trust the result. On the surface, Korea still appears to be a country with relatively high turnout, yet among younger generations and certain social groups, trust in the system has already eroded visibly. If this trend is left unattended, we may one day wake up to find that only the signboard reading Democratic Republic remains, while the inside has been hollowed out. The war over the system is a war fought not with guns and tanks, but with institutions, public opinion, data, and algorithms. Elections are the most decisive battles in that war. From a relational perspective, victory or defeat in this systemic conflict depends on who designs and controls the network of relationships connecting a single ballot paper, political power, and public trust. The ballot originates in the hands of the citizen, but if the relationships linking that ballot to the powers and technologies that count and interpret it, and to the law and the media, are opaque, then the forces seeking to defend the constitutional order are already being pushed back. How the world makes the counting of votes transparent. Advanced democracies, after long periods of trial and error, have reached a shared conclusion. The transparency of the vote counting process is the safety belt of the system. In many democracies across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, the results at each polling station are disclosed, the counting process is opened in real time, and parallel monitoring mechanisms are put in place so that the counting meets the expectations and standards of ordinary citizens. When international election observation missions assess elections in various countries, the first thing they look at is not the scenery at the polling stations, but the transparency of the counting and aggregation process. In many countries, once voting ends, the ballots are counted on the spot at the same polling station. The results are written on paper and posted on the wall. Party agents and citizen observers check the numbers together and photograph them as a permanent record. After that, the process by which these figures are aggregated at the constituency level, then at regional and national levels, is also disclosed step by step. In some countries, all polling station level results are published on public websites so that any citizen can compare the results from their local polling station with the national totals. This level of transparency is no longer something exceptional. It is becoming common sense, approaching a genuine world-based practice. Another important mechanism is parallel vote tabulation. In several emerging democracies, civic organizations and international bodies randomly select a sample of polling stations where citizens independently record and aggregate the results. These numbers are then compared with the official totals to see whether there are significant discrepancies. This is not about treating the government as an enemy. It is about designing the system as one of mutual checks and balances. Instead of naively expecting that people will always be perfect, it begins from the realistic premise that people can make mistakes and be tempted, and that such risks must be blocked by institutional design. The shadow of digital dictatorship, electronic counting, and data manipulation. In the 21st century, the battlefield of elections has expanded beyond paper to servers, networks, and algorithms. Electronic counting, electronic aggregation, and integrated election management systems offer clear advantages in terms of efficiency and speed, yet they can also create a single point of failure where, if something is compromised, the entire national election can be affected at once. Citizens stamp their seals on physical ballot papers, but the actual results move inside code and databases. It is at this juncture that the shadow of digital dictatorship can fall. Conflicts surrounding electronic election systems are recurring all over the world. Some countries introduced electronic counting machines, but later reverted to fully manual counting after distrust and confusion grew. Others adopted electronic voting, but wrote into law the requirement that every vote must also leave a paper trail so that a full manual recount is always possible. Election technology is merely a tool. The real issue is whether it leaves human verifiable traces. Across advanced democracies, even when digital technologies are used, the common design principle is that final results must rest on paper records or other independent verification mechanisms that can be checked by the human eye. From a relational perspective, electronic counting machines and centralized servers are not inherently good or evil. What truly matters is the web of relationships in which these technologies are embedded, how they are connected to the polling stations, counting centers, central servers, communication networks, the courts, and the media. If this relational network is sealed in a language understood only by a small circle of experts and officials, with no windows through which citizens and political parties can meaningfully intervene, then digital technology can quickly become the tool of digital dictatorship. Conversely, if the architecture and code of the system are opened, if random recounts and parallel tabulations are institutionalized, and if mechanisms are in place for constant scrutiny of malfunction and the possibility of manipulation, then digital technology can become a shield that protects liberal democracy. The problem is not the technology itself, but the philosophy of design, rethinking Korea's election architecture through the lens of FEA. Let us now borrow the perspective of enterprise architecture, especially the Federal Enterprise Architecture, FEA, used by the United States federal government to re-examine elections in Korea. FEA views government as a single, vast system and designs it by linking business areas, services and applications, data and technology infrastructure. Elections are no different. Voter registration, constituency delimitation, candidate registration, voting, counting, dispute resolution, and post-election audits form a single business chain that must be underpinned by tightly integrated information systems, data structures, networks, and security architectures. The greatest weakness of Korea's current election system is that this entire chain does not appear in front of the public as a single coherent picture. Business processes, information, data, and technology fight piecemeal battles, each in isolation. Early voting, election day voting, overseas voting, and postal ballots are handled in different ways, scattered across separate processes. Counting and electronic aggregation, statistical analysis, and auditing operate in yet another distinct system. As a result, even after an election is over, ordinary citizens cannot, at a glance, understand the path by which my ballot travelled to become those numbers. Where relationships are invisible, distrust grows naturally. Korea must therefore design a true election FEA. First, from a business perspective, the entire process from voter registration to post-election audits must be drawn as a single process map. Second, a data reference model must be built that clarifies what data are generated at each stage and at what point, and to whom they are disclosed. Third, the applications and systems that implement this process must be restructured not around administrative convenience, but around citizen verifiability. Fourth, the technology infrastructure and security architecture must be redesigned according to criteria that prioritize traceability, re-verifiability, and independent verification over speed and efficiency. This is the direction of election reform that emerges from combining relational philosophy with FEA, blind spots in the Public Official Election Act, and the clash with popular sovereignty. Election systems are not only a matter of technology, they are also a matter of law. Korea's Public Official Election Act contains many provisions intended to safeguard electoral order. However, a significant number of these provisions, when viewed in light of social change, the digital environment, and international standards, are criticized for excessively restricting citizens' right to know and right to verify. The freedom of election campaigning and freedom of expression are affected, as are the recording and sharing of the counting process and even attempts at parallel tabulation. For example, in many countries, party agents at counting stations photograph the official result sheets and independently aggregate the numbers to compare them with the final official results. Parallel tabulation by civil society and parties is widespread. In contrast, Korea's Public Official Election Act and related guidelines impose a variety of restrictions on photographing ballot papers, filming the counting process, and collecting data inside counting centers. The stated purpose of these rules is to maintain order and protect the secrecy of the ballot, but in practice they often have the effect of discouraging the monitoring activities of citizens, political parties, and civic groups. Whenever questions are raised about an election, one hears the lament, "There is no way to conduct proper verification without breaking the law." Furthermore, the Election Act does not fully reflect the realities of digital age communication. If online political expression, the sharing of election-related information, and citizens' commentary on the counting process are regulated too rigidly, then even legitimate doubts about those in power and the system can be branded as spreading false information or disturbing electoral order. In such an environment, citizens who harbour doubts simply keep silent, and mistrust of the system accumulates beneath the surface. From a relational perspective, this is an alarming sign that the healthy relationships of debate and feedback between the people and the authorities, between law and institutions, are being severed. The Public Official Election Act must be both a shield that protects electoral fairness and a guardian that guarantees the people's right to verify. At present, the balance between these two functions is badly broken. The direction of reform is clear. First, the Election Act and related regulations should be revised to broadly permit recording, photographing, and parallel tabulation by observers and citizens at the counting stage. Second, the line between freedom of expression and the regulation of false information should be redrawn in accordance with international standards, creating a sophisticated framework that encourages legitimate questioning and criticism while firmly blocking malicious fabrication and manipulation. Third, every rule should be grounded in the principle of protecting citizens' sovereignty and their right to verify, and the language of the law should be refined so that election authorities and other organs of power cannot interpret it with excessive discretion. Only then can we narrow the blind spots of the Election Act and restore trust in the system. Civic literacy that protects liberal democracy, the power to follow my vote to the end. Finally, let us reconsider Korea's liberal democracy from a relational perspective. A system is not merely a collection of constitutions, statutes, and institutions. It is the totality of relationships linking each citizen with power, institutions, data, and technology. Today, Korea ranks among the leading countries in the world in terms of economy, technology, and culture, yet in the civic literacy required to understand and oversee our system and politics, we remain at a beginner's level. There is a serious contradiction in proclaiming our commitment to defending liberal democracy while paying little attention to how a single ballot with our own mark on it is counted. According to several global democracy indices, Korea is still classified as a free country, but warning lights are flashing in areas such as press freedom, internet freedom, and the quality of political participation. Some indices already suggest that Korea has slipped from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. Such changes do not occur overnight. They unfold gradually over years as citizens grow indifferent to how the system operates, as institutions drift away from the public eye, and as laws are quietly amended in ways that restrain citizens' eyes and mouths. By the time a major incident finally exposes the problem, we may find ourselves well past the point where reversal is easy. The phrase, an ignorant, incompetent, and self-seeking citizenry is not meant to insult the people. It is a warning aimed at confronting the reality that the design of our system, together with our education, media, and politics, has allowed citizens to be left in such a state. From now on, citizens must no longer remain guests of the system. They must become its architects. We must move from being citizens who cast a ballot and then forget about it, to citizens who cast a ballot and track it to the very end. The more citizens insist on asking, I cast my vote, why won't you show me the counting, and press that question to its conclusion, the more likely it is that this country will stand not as a model of digital dictatorship, but as a model of digital liberal democracy. That is the most peaceful yet most powerful way to prevail in the war over the system. I sincerely hope that today's commentary, which began with the greeting, "Hello, this is Professor Nam Yong Lee on Lee Nam Yong Professor TV," will serve as a small turning point that helps citizens be reborn as guardians of the system who follow their own votes all the way to the end. The more citizens there are who trace the entire journey of their single ballot, the more transparent, more honest, and stronger our liberal democracy will become. Thank you for watching Professor Lee Nam Yong's long-form commentary.